The lie was so transparent that even the hired guns looked uncomfortable. Everyone present knew that Alton had no intention of providing medical care for anyone. He had come here for revenge, pure and simple, and a sick baby was just collateral damage in his personal war against Gideon Hale. "Over my dead body," Gideon said quietly, and suddenly his rifle was in his hands, pointed directly at Alton's chest. The hired guns reacted instantly, their own weapons appearing with practiced speed. In the space of a heartbeat, the peaceful evening had become an armed standoff, with death hanging in the balance. "Now that's a mistake," Alton said, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Threatening a law officer in the performance of his duties, that's a hanging offense." "So is murder," Gideon replied calmly, "and taking a sick baby away from medical care is murder, no matter how you try to dress it up legally." "Gideon," Sarah said quietly, "there are children here." "I know, that's why I can't let these men take them." The silence stretched out like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of wind in the pines and Lydia's labored breathing from inside the cabin. Caleb could feel the weight of the moment, the terrible knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything for all of them. That's when the first shot rang out, not from any of the men in the yard, but from the tree line beyond Sarah's cabin. One of the hired guns spun and fell, blood blooming across his shirt front as he hit the ground hard. "Ambush!" Alton screamed, diving for cover behind Sarah's woodpile. "We're under attack!" But as more shots erupted from the darkness, Caleb realized that whoever was shooting wasn't aiming at random targets. They were systematically picking off Alton's men while carefully avoiding the people in and around the cabin. Marcus emerged from the trees like an avenging angel, his old military rifle smoking in his hands and his weathered face set in grim lines. "About time you showed up," Gideon called out, never taking his eyes off Alton's hiding place. "Took me a while to get into position," Marcus replied, working the bolt on his rifle. "These old bones don't move as fast as they used to." The remaining hired gun, seeing his partner down and facing superior numbers, apparently decided that Deputy Alton's money wasn't worth dying for. He threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "I'm out," he called. "This ain't my fight, smart man," Marcus observed. "You can go, but if I see you back in this territory, I won't be so understanding." The man didn't need to be told twice. He mounted his horse and rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving Alton alone and outnumbered behind the woodpile. "Come on out, Cord," Gideon called. "It's over." "Like hell it is." Alton's voice was shrill with rage and fear. "I've got a legal warrant and I mean to execute it." "Your warrant's not worth the paper it's written on, and you know it," Sarah called back. "Judge Morrison never signed off on taking children away from medical care. Morrison's not the only judge in the territory." "No, but he's the only one with jurisdiction here, which means your warrant is fraudulent, which means you're not here on official business. You're just a man with a gun making threats." The truth of that statement seemed to deflate some of Alton's bluster. He remained hidden behind the woodpile, but his voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Those children belong to me legally and properly. I'll be back with proper authority." "You do that," Gideon replied, "but next time make sure your paperwork's in order, and maybe bring more men." Alton emerged from behind the woodpile slowly, his hands visible and his face twisted with impotent rage. "You think you're smart, Hale, but you can't hide up here forever. Sooner or later you'll have to come to town, and when you do—" "When I do, I'll be ready," Gideon said simply. "Now get off Sarah's property before I decide that you've worn out your welcome permanently." Alton mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, but he was clearly beaten. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow now, the threat of a man who had overplayed his hand and lost. They watched him ride away into the darkness, his horse's hoofbeats fading until they were swallowed by the vast silence of the mountain wilderness. Only then did the tension begin to drain from the scene, leaving behind the exhausted aftermath of crisis averted. "Is everyone all right?" Sarah asked, moving to check on the wounded hired gun. He was unconscious but breathing, and the wound, while serious, didn't appear to be fatal. "We're fine," Gideon assured her. "Marcus, how did you know to follow us? Saw the dust from their horses about an hour after you left." The older man replied, reloading his rifle with practiced movements. "Figured it couldn't be anything good, so I decided to come see what was what." "Thank God you did," Caleb said fervently. "If you hadn't shown up when you did—" "Don't think about it," Marcus advised. "What matters is that it's over." But even as relief washed over him, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was wrong. This wasn't over, it was just the beginning. Alton would be back, probably with more men and better legal cover, and next time they might not be so lucky. Inside the cabin, Lydia's breathing had grown noticeably easier during the confrontation, as if even she sensed that the immediate danger had passed. But she was still desperately sick, still fighting a battle that could go either way. "How long before she's well enough to travel?" Gideon asked Sarah as they gathered around the baby's makeshift bed. "A few days, maybe a week if we're careful. But Gideon—" Sarah's voice carried warning. "Alton wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. He does have legal claim to these children, at least on paper, and there are judges in the territory who might be willing to sign off on his warrant if he makes the right arguments." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that hiding up here on Copper Ridge isn't a permanent solution. Sooner or later you're going to have to deal with this legally, or it'll never end." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight as he considered their options. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had been building for hours. "Then we'll deal with it legally. But first we make sure Lydia's strong enough to survive whatever comes next." As the night deepened around Sarah's cabin, they settled in for what they all knew might be their last peaceful hours for some time to come. Outside, the mountain wilderness stretched away in all directions, vast and seemingly empty. But somewhere out there, Deputy Cord Alton was nursing his wounded pride and planning his next move. The battle for the Ward children had only just begun. The battle for the Ward children had only just begun, but the first shots of winter arrived before Alton could fire his next volley. 3 days after the confrontation at Sarah's cabin, the first snow began to fall, not the gentle dusting that might. The battle for the Ward children had only just begun, but the first shots of winter arrived before Alton could fire his next volley. 3 days after the confrontation at Sarah's cabin, the first snow began to fall, not the gentle dusting that might grace an October morning, but the serious business-like snow that announced winter's intention to settle in for a long stay. By evening, 6 inches had accumulated, and the temperature had plummeted to levels that made travel treacherous for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. "We're snowed in," Sarah announced matter-of-factly, as she peered out her cabin window at the white curtain that had descended over the mountains. "These roads won't be passable for weeks." Caleb felt a complex mixture of relief and anxiety at her words. Relief because it meant Alton couldn't return with reinforcements and legal papers. Anxiety because it also meant they were trapped here, completely cut off from the outside world, with Lydia still fighting for her life. But the baby had been showing steady improvement under Sarah's expert care. Her fever had broken on the 2nd day, and though she was still weak and underweight, she was finally beginning to eat regularly, and her breathing had cleared considerably. "Look at that," Sarah said with satisfaction, watching as Lydia managed to drink nearly half a cup of the nutrient-rich broth she had been preparing. "She's got the constitution of a fighter, this one." "She gets that from her mother," Caleb said softly, smoothing his sister's wispy hair. "Ma never gave up on anything, no matter how bad things got." "Tell me about her," Sarah suggested, settling into the rocking chair with her own cup of coffee. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with a sound like distant wolves, but inside, the cabin was warm and secure. So Caleb talked about his parents, about his mother's laugh, and his father's patient way of explaining how things worked about the small farm they had tried to make successful before the drought, and the fever took everything away. It felt good to remember them, as they had been in better times before illness, and desperation had worn them down to shadows of themselves. "They sound like good people," Sarah said when he finished. They were. They didn't deserve what happened to them. "Most folks don't deserve what happens to them," Marcus observed from his position near the fire where he was cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "But that doesn't stop it from happening." Gideon looked up from the medical text he had been studying, one of several that Sarah kept on hand for reference. "The question is what we do with what happens to us. Your parents gave you something precious before they died. What's that? They taught you to take care of people you love no matter what it costs you. That's not nothing, Caleb, that's everything." The simple truth of those words hit Caleb with unexpected force. He had spent so many months focused on his failures, his inability to save his parents, to keep Lydia healthy, to provide the kind of life they deserved, that he had lost sight of what he had managed to accomplish. Despite everything, Lydia was alive. Despite being just 14 years old, with no resources and no help, he had kept her fed and safe and loved through the worst crisis of their lives. "Sarah," Gideon said, suddenly looking up from the medical book with an expression of dawning realization. "This section on malnutrition recovery, it says here that babies who survive severe nutritional deficiency often develop stronger immune systems than those who never face such challenges." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "The body learns to make the most of whatever resources it has available. Lydia may actually be healthier in the long run because of what she's been through." The idea that their suffering might have served some purpose, that Lydia might emerge from this ordeal stronger rather than permanently damaged, was almost too hopeful to believe. But as Caleb watched his sister's steady breathing and saw the growing alertness in her dark eyes, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, the worst truly was behind them. That optimism lasted exactly 6 days. On the 7th morning of their stay at Sarah's cabin, Caleb woke to the sound of voices outside, low, urgent conversations that carried the unmistakable tension of men planning something unpleasant. He slipped from his bedroll and crept to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass at a sight that made his blood run cold. At least a dozen men had somehow made their way through the snow to surround Sarah's cabin. They were armed and organized, spread out in a rough circle that covered all the possible escape routes. And at their center, looking like a man who had spent the past week nursing his wounded pride into a burning fury, stood Deputy Cord Alton. "Gideon," Caleb whispered urgently, shaking the older man awake. "They're back, and they brought an army." Gideon was instantly alert, moving to the window with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to waking up to trouble. His face darkened as he took in the scene outside. "Marcus," he called softly, "we've got company." The older man appeared from the back room where he had been sleeping, already dressed and carrying his rifle. "How many dozen, maybe more? Alton's with them, and they look like they mean business this time." Sarah emerged from the small alcove where she had been sleeping near Lydia's makeshift bed, her gray hair neatly braided despite the early hour, and her dark eyes sharp with alertness. "Professional men," she observed after taking her own look through the window. "Not just hired guns this time. These boys know what they're doing." "Sarah Blackwood." Alton's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "I know you can hear me in there. I've come back with proper authority this time, and I mean to execute it." Sarah moved to the door but didn't open it. "What kind of authority?" she called back. "Federal authority," Alton replied with obvious satisfaction. "Turns out that interfering with the lawful execution of indentured servant contracts is a federal crime. I've got U.S. Marshal Tom Brennan here with me, and he's got papers that say those children are coming with us, whether you like it or not." Caleb felt his stomach drop as a new voice joined the conversation, deeper and more authoritative than Alton's, carrying the weight of genuine legal power. "Mrs. Blackwood, The marshal called out, "I'm Marshal Brennan, and I have a federal warrant for the return of 2 fugitive servants. I'd prefer to handle this peacefully, but I'm prepared to use whatever force is necessary to execute my orders." "Can I see these papers?" Sarah asked. "Of course. I'm going to approach the door unarmed. Please, don't do anything foolish." A tall man in a dark coat separated himself from the group outside and walked slowly toward the cabin, his hands visible and empty. He was older than Alton, probably in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent dealing with frontier justice. When he reached the door, he produced a folded document from his coat and held it up to the window. Sarah studied the paper carefully, her face growing increasingly grim as she read. "It's legitimate," she said finally, her voice heavy with regret. "Federal Court in Denver, Judge Harold Morrison presiding." "Morrison?" Gideon's voice was sharp with surprise. "The same Morrison from Ashford. His brother, apparently. And according to this warrant, Gideon Hale is now considered a fugitive from federal justice for harboring escaped servants and interfering with lawful commerce." The implications of that statement hit Caleb like a physical blow. Not only were he and Lydia being hunted, but Gideon, the man who had saved them from a life of misery with Deputy Alton, was now a wanted man because of his kindness. "This is my fault," Caleb said, his voice thick with guilt. "If I hadn't stolen that bread, none of this would have happened." "Son," Marcus said firmly, "the only person at fault here is Cord Alton, and whoever's backing his play. This isn't about bread or contracts or legal technicalities. This is about power and revenge, pure and simple." "Mrs. Blackwood," Marshal Brennan called from outside, "I need an answer. Are you going to cooperate, or do we need to take this cabin by force?" Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who had become her temporary family. Gideon with his quiet strength, Marcus with his fierce loyalty, and Caleb with his desperate love for his baby sister. These were good people who had done nothing wrong except try to help children in need. The thought of watching them suffer for their kindness made her chest tight with anger. "Marshal," she called back, "that baby is still recovering from pneumonia. Moving her in this weather could kill her." "Then we'll take extra care to keep her warm," Brennan replied. "But my orders are clear. Those children leave with us today. And if she dies on the trail, that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is executing federal warrants." The cold calculation in his voice made it clear that Marshal Brennan was not a man who could be swayed by appeals to mercy or common sense. He had his orders, and he would carry them out regardless of the consequences to anyone involved. "What about medical care?" Sarah tried. "She still needs constant attention." "Deputy Alton has assured me that proper medical care will be provided at his facility." The lie was so transparent that it would have been laughable under other circumstances. Everyone present knew that Alton had no medical facilities, no training, and no intention of providing anything more than the bare minimum required to keep his property alive and working. "Sarah," Gideon said quietly, "how many ways out of here are there?" "Just the one road, and they've got it covered," she replied grimly. "The only other option is the old mining trail that leads over Widow's Peak, but that's a 2-day hike in good weather. In this snow, with a sick baby." "It would be suicide," Marcus finished. "Mrs. Blackwood," Brennan's voice had lost its patient tone, "I'm giving you 1 more minute to open this door voluntarily. After that, we're coming in." Sarah looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the warm interior that had become a sanctuary for people who desperately needed one. Then she moved to the door and began working the heavy wooden bar that secured it. "Sarah, no," Gideon said urgently. "I won't have blood spilled in my home," she replied firmly. "And I won't see that baby put at risk because of adult stubbornness. If they want to take the children, they'll have to live with the consequences of their actions." "But no buts, Gideon. Sometimes the only victory available is making sure your enemies have to look at themselves in the mirror afterward." The door swung open, revealing the circle of armed men that surrounded the cabin. Marshal Brennan stepped forward, flanked by Deputy Alton, whose pale eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Thank you for being reasonable, Mrs. Blackwood," Brennan said formally. "Now, if you'll just produce the fugitives—" "They're here," Sarah replied, stepping aside to reveal Gideon, Marcus, and Caleb standing in the cabin's main room. "But I want it on record that you're taking a sick baby away from medical care against the advice of her physician." "Noted," Brennan said without apparent concern. "Mr. Ward, gather your things. You and your sister are coming with us." Caleb moved to the alcove where Lydia lay sleeping, his hands shaking as he began to wrap her in the warmest blankets he could find. She felt so small and fragile in his arms, still far from fully recovered despite the improvements of the past week. "Please," he said, turning to face Marshal Brennan with desperate eyes. "Just let her stay until she's stronger. I'll come with you now. I'll do whatever you want, but please don't take her away from the medical care she needs." "That's not how this works," Alton spoke up, his voice filled with vindictive pleasure. "The warrant specifies both children. We're not leaving empty-handed again." "Deputy Alton," Brennan said with a hint of warning in his tone, "I'll handle this." But the damage was already done. Alton's obvious satisfaction in separating a sick baby from medical care had revealed the true nature of this operation. This wasn't about law enforcement or legal contracts. This was about revenge. "Marshal," Gideon said quietly, "I'd like to offer myself in exchange for the children." Brennan turned to study him with professional interest. "What kind of exchange?" "I'll come with you voluntarily. I'll face whatever charges you want to bring, but let the children stay here until the baby is fully recovered." "Gideon, no," Caleb protested. "You've done enough for us already." "Not nearly enough," Gideon replied, his gray eyes never leaving Brennan's face. "What do you say, marshal one man who's actually named in your warrant in exchange for two children who are only valuable as property?" Brennan considered the offer for a long moment, and for just an instant Caleb thought he might actually agree. But then Alton stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "That's not acceptable," he said sharply. "My contract specifies both children, and I mean to collect what's mine." "Your contract," Marcus said with disgust, "isn't worth the paper it's written on, and everybody here knows it." "My contract is legal and binding," Alton shot back, "and backed by federal authority." "Your contract," Sarah said quietly, "is an abomination, and someday you'll have to answer for what you're doing here." "The only thing I have to answer for is the lawful execution of my property rights," Alton replied. "Now stop wasting time and hand over those children." Marshal Brennan looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, but his duty was clear. "I'm sorry," he said to Sarah, and there seemed to be genuine regret in his voice. "But I have my orders." "Then execute them," Sarah replied with dignity. "But know that you're taking a sick baby away from medical care to satisfy one man's petty revenge." As Caleb gathered Lydia's few belongings, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a normal boy with parents and a home and a future that seemed reasonably secure. Now he was a fugitive facing return to a life of servitude under a man who clearly intended to use that power for cruelty rather than justice. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, he found strength in unexpected places. Gideon's quiet courage, Marcus's fierce loyalty, Sarah's compassionate competence. This people had shown him that goodness existed in the world, that there were adults who would sacrifice their own safety to protect children they barely knew. "Caleb," Sarah said quietly as he prepared to leave, "remember what I taught you about her medication. The fever could come back, especially if she gets chilled or stressed." "I'll remember," he promised, though they both knew that his ability to provide proper medical care would be severely limited once they reached Alton's place. "And remember," Gideon added, stepping close enough to speak without being overheard, "that good people don't give up. No matter how dark things get, there's always another move to make. Time's up, Alton announced. Let's go. As they prepared to leave the warmth and safety of Sarah's cabin, Caleb felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Once again, he was leaving behind the only security he had known, venturing into an uncertain future with nothing but his love for Lydia to sustain him. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone. Somewhere behind him, good people were already making plans to help him, already refusing to accept that this was how his story would end. The journey back to Ashford was a nightmare of cold exhaustion and constant fear for Lydia's health. Despite Sarah's careful preparations and Caleb's vigilant attention, the baby began showing signs of distress almost immediately. The jarring motion of the horses, the bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest blankets, and the stress of being separated from familiar surroundings all took their toll. By the end of the first day, Lydia's breathing had become labored again, and Caleb could feel the heat of returning fever through her blankets. "She's getting sick again," he told Marshal Brennan during one of their brief stops to rest the horses. "She needs to be somewhere warm and dry with proper medical care." "She'll get medical care when we reach town," Brennan replied, but his voice carried less conviction than it had at Sarah's cabin. "When will that be?" "Tomorrow afternoon, if the weather holds." Tomorrow afternoon might as well have been next year. Caleb could feel Lydia growing weaker with each passing hour, could see the flush of fever returning to her small face. The improvements that Sarah's careful nursing had achieved were being undone with frightening speed. "Please," he begged Alton during their next stop, "just let me take her back to Sarah's cabin. I'll come with you willingly after she's well." "Not a chance," Alton replied with cold satisfaction. "You had your chance to cooperate and you chose to run instead. Now you live with the consequences." "But she's just a baby." "She never did anything to hurt you." "She's property that belongs to me," Alton said flatly, "and I'll decide what happens to my property." The casual cruelty of those words hit Caleb like a physical blow. This man, this petty tyrant with his bought authority and his wounded pride, was willing to let an innocent baby suffer and possibly die just to prove a point about his own power. That night, huddled in a crude shelter that offered little protection from the wind and snow, Caleb held Lydia close and listened to her increasingly labored breathing. She was dying. He could feel it in the way her small body seemed to be growing lighter, could hear it in the wet rattle that had returned to her lungs. "Hold on," he whispered to her in the darkness. "Just hold on a little longer, please." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he was asking too much of someone so small and fragile. How much suffering could one baby endure before her tiny reserves of strength were finally exhausted? The answer, it seemed, was not much more. By dawn of the second day, Lydia was barely conscious, her breathing so shallow that Caleb had to put his ear to her chest to make sure her heart was still beating. Even Marshal Brennan, who had maintained professional detachment throughout the journey, looked concerned when he saw her condition. "How much farther to town?" he asked one of his men. 4 hours, maybe 5, if we push hard." Brennan studied Lydia's flushed face and listened to her labored breathing. For a moment, Caleb thought the marshal might actually call off. The journey might decide that federal authority didn't extend to killing babies for the sake of property disputes. But then Alton appeared at his elbow, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "She'll be fine once we get her someplace warm," he said dismissively. "Babies are tougher than they look." "She needs medical attention now," Caleb said desperately. "Can't you see she's dying?" "What I see," Alton replied coldly, "is a boy trying to manipulate his way out of a legal obligation. Your sister will receive whatever care I deem appropriate once we reach my property." The journey continued each hour, bringing them closer to Ashford and farther from any hope of salvation. By midday, Lydia had lapsed into complete unconsciousness, her small body limp and burning with fever. Caleb rode in a daze of exhaustion and despair, holding his sister's motionless form and trying to prepare himself for the unthinkable. That's when he heard the sound that would change everything, the distant crack of rifle fire echoing across the snowy landscape. The first shot took down one of Alton's men before anyone could react. The second scattered the horses and sent the remaining guards scrambling for cover among the rocks and trees that lined the trail. In the confusion that followed, Caleb found himself thrown from his horse, still clutching Lydia protectively as he hit the frozen ground hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. "Stay down!" someone shouted from the tree line, but Caleb couldn't tell if it was friend or foe giving the command. What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense gunfight Caleb had ever witnessed, a carefully orchestrated ambush that systematically eliminated Alton's advantage in numbers while avoiding any harm to the children caught in the middle. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of the guards were wounded. 2 had fled into the wilderness, and Deputy Alton himself was cowering behind a fallen log with his hands raised in surrender. Marshal Brennan, to his credit, had tried to maintain order throughout the chaos, but he was one man facing overwhelming odds. When Gideon Hale emerged from the trees with his rifle trained on the marshal's chest, Brennan slowly raised his own hands. "Gideon," Caleb called out weakly, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. "Right here," Gideon replied, moving quickly to where Caleb lay in the snow. "How's Lydia?" "Bad," Caleb admitted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and relief. "Really bad. She needs help now." Gideon knelt in the snow and gently examined the baby, his weathered face growing grim as he took in her condition. "Marcus," he called, "we need to get her warm, fast." Marcus appeared from behind a cluster of boulders carrying supplies that suggested this rescue had been carefully planned rather than impulsively executed. Within minutes, they had established a makeshift shelter and begun the careful process of trying to stabilize Lydia's condition. "How did you find us?" Caleb asked as Marcus worked to get warm broth into the baby's system. "Wasn't hard," Marcus replied grimly. 12 men and a wagon leave a trail even a blind man could follow. We've been tracking you since yesterday morning." "Half the territory seems like," Gideon said with satisfaction. "Word's gotten around about what Alton's been up to, and folks aren't too happy about it. Federal authority or no federal authority, there are some things that don't sit right with decent people." Marshal Brennan, who had been listening to this conversation with growing unease, finally spoke up. "Mr. Hale, I appreciate your concern for these children, but you're interfering with a federal operation. That's a serious crime." "So is child endangerment," Gideon replied without looking up from Lydia. "And last I checked, there's no federal law that says property rights trump a baby's right to live. The law is clear." "The law," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing, "is whatever I say it is in my jurisdiction." Everyone turned to see a small, elderly man approaching on horseback, wearing the badge of a federal judge and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as final. "Judge Morrison." Marshal Brennan looked confused. "Sir, what are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess that should never have been made in the first place," Judge Harold Morrison replied as he dismounted. "Tom, I'm hereby rescinding the warrant you've been operating under. It was issued based on but false information and fraudulent documentation." "Sir, I don't understand." "Deputy Alton," Morrison continued, ignoring Brennan's confusion, "you're under arrest for falsifying federal documents, abuse of office, and child endangerment. Marshal Brennan, you'll take him into custody immediately." Alton, who had been silent throughout the rescue, finally found his voice. "You can't do this. I have legal contracts properly executed. You have fraudulent documents that you obtained through perjury and bribery." Morrison cut him off. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your little arrangement with my brother? Did you think federal judges don't talk to each other?" The implications of Morrison's words hit Caleb like a thunderbolt. The warrant that had seemed so official, so insurmountable, had been based on lies and corruption from the very beginning. "Judge Morrison," Gideon said carefully. What about the children's legal status? What about it? Morrison replied. The original auction was held under irregular circumstances. The contracts were fraudulently obtained, and the subsequent legal proceedings were tainted by corruption. As far as federal law is concerned, those children are free. Free? Caleb could barely process what he was hearing. I mean, Morrison said, with something that might have been a smile, that you and your sister are no longer indentured to anyone. You're free to go wherever you choose, with whomever you choose. The words hit Caleb with such force that he felt dizzy. Free. After months of running, hiding, and living in constant fear of being dragged back to a life of servitude, they were simply free. But Lydia, he said, looking down at his sister's pale face, she's so sick. Which is why, Morrison continued, I'm recommending that you remain in the custody of Mr. Hale here at least until she's fully recovered, assuming, of course, that's what you want. Caleb looked at Gideon, this man who had risked everything to save two children he barely knew, who had faced down federal marshals and corrupt officials without hesitation. The choice was no choice at all. Yes, he said simply, that's what I want. As Marshal Brennan took Deputy Alton into custody, the former lawman, now looking small and defeated, without his borrowed authority, Caleb found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been just another frontier boy trying to help his family survive. Today, he was free, surrounded by people who cared about him, with a future that was his to choose. But even as relief and gratitude flooded through him, he knew that the hardest part still lay ahead. Lydia was desperately sick, possibly dying, and all the legal victories in the world wouldn't save her if they couldn't get her the medical attention she needed. How far to Sarah's cabin? He asked Gideon. Too far for her condition, Gideon replied grimly. But there's another option. Doc Peterson in Millfield. He's only 6 hours from here, and he's got a real medical facility. Will she make it 6 hours? Gideon met his eyes with the kind of honesty that comes from a lifetime of facing hard truths. I don't know, but it's her best chance. So they began another desperate race against time, this one carrying them toward hope instead of despair. As their small party set out across the snowy landscape, Caleb held his sister close and whispered the same words he had been repeating since the day their parents died. Hold on, Lydia, just hold on. But this time he wasn't facing the darkness alone. This time he had allies, resources, and something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The road to Millfield stretched out before them, treacherous but no longer impossible. And somewhere at the end of it, if they could just make it in time, was the possibility of a future neither Ward child had dared to imagine. A future where they were free. A future where they were free, but first, they had to live to see it. The race to Millfield became a blur of desperate hours, punctuated by moments of terror when Lydia's breathing would slow to almost nothing, then surge back with rattling gasps that tore at Caleb's heart. Dr. Peterson's medical facility turned out to be a modest clinic attached to his home, but it was equipped with real medicines, proper instruments, and, most importantly, a physician who understood that some battles couldn't be won with frontier remedies alone. Acute pneumonia complicated by severe malnutrition, Peterson diagnosed after his initial examination, his weathered hands gentle as they moved over Lydia's tiny form. How long has she been this sick? 2 weeks, maybe more, Caleb admitted, hovering anxiously beside the examination table. She was getting better at Sarah Blackwood's place, but then someone decided to drag a sick baby through a snowstorm, Peterson finished grimly. Well, the damage is done. Now we have to see if we can undo it. For 3 days and nights, Caleb barely left Lydia's side as Dr. Peterson worked to save her life. The physician tried every treatment in his considerable arsenal steam tents to ease her breathing, carefully measured doses of laudanum to help her rest, and a complex regimen of medicines that he administered with the precision of a master craftsman. Will she live? Caleb asked on the morning of the fourth day when Lydia's fever had finally broken and her breathing seemed less labored. "Ask me again in a week," Peterson replied cautiously. "She's turned the corner, but babies this sick can relapse quickly. We're not out of the woods yet." Gideon appeared in the doorway of the clinic, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had been wrestling with difficult decisions. "How is she?" he asked quietly. "Better," Peterson said. "Much better, but she'll need careful nursing for weeks, maybe months. And even then, there may be lasting effects from what she's been through." "What kind of effects?" "Hard to say. Sometimes children who survive severe illness are stronger for it. Sometimes they're left with weakened constitutions that plague them for life. Only time will tell." Caleb looked down at his sister's peaceful face, noting how the flush of fever had finally faded and how her breathing came steady and even. She looked so small and fragile lying there, but there was something different about her now, a resilience that hadn't been there before, as if the ordeal had taught her body how to fight. "She's a survivor," he said softly, "just like Ma always said she would be." Over the following weeks, as Lydia slowly regained her strength, Caleb found himself settling into a routine that felt almost normal. He helped Dr. Peterson with his patients during the day, learning basic medical skills that fascinated him with their precision and purpose. In the evenings, he would sit by Lydia's bed and read to her from the collection of books that Gideon had brought from Copper Ridge. "You're good with the patients," Peterson observed one afternoon as they finished treating a farmer who had suffered a badly broken arm. "Ever think about studying medicine?" The idea had never occurred to Caleb before, but as he considered it, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about the future. "I don't have the education for it," he said reluctantly. "Never had proper schooling past the basics." "Education can be acquired," Peterson replied with a slight smile. "What matters is whether you have the temperament for it, and from what I've seen you do." That conversation planted a seed that grew stronger with each passing day. The idea of becoming a doctor, of having the knowledge and skills to help people the way Peterson and Sarah had helped Lydia, began to feel less like an impossible dream and more like an achievable goal. "What do you think?" he asked Gideon one evening as they sat by the fire in the clinic's small waiting room. "About me studying medicine, I mean." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I think," he said carefully, "that every man needs something to fight for, something bigger than himself, and I think you found yours. But the cost, medical school books, all of it. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Gideon interrupted gently. "I'm offering, and before you start protesting about charity, let me tell you something about investments." He leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. 8 years ago, I was a broken man, living alone on a mountain, convinced that the world had nothing left to offer and that I had nothing left to give. Then Marcus showed up, and later you and Lydia, and suddenly I had reasons to get up in the morning again. Gideon, I'm not finished. You see, Caleb, sometimes helping others is the most selfish thing a man can do. It gives his life meaning, purpose, hope. So when I invest in your future, I'm not being generous, I'm being practical. I'm ensuring that the rest of my life has something worthwhile to show for it. The simple honesty of those words hit Caleb with stunning force. He had spent so long thinking of himself as a burden, as someone who took more than he gave, that the idea of being valuable to others in return seemed almost revolutionary. Besides, Gideon continued with a slight smile, Copper Ridge could use a doctor, and I can think of worse ways to spend my old age than having a physician in the family. Family. The word hung in the air between them like a promise heavy with implications that neither man was quite ready to voice directly, but the meaning was clear enough somewhere along the way, in the space between an auction block and a medical clinic. They had become more than guardian and ward. They had become something that mattered more than legal contracts or social obligations. They had become family. The formal adoption papers were signed 3 weeks later in Judge Morrison's chambers in Denver. The proceeding was simple, almost anticlimactic after everything they had been through. Morrison asked a few perfunctory questions. Gideon signed the necessary documents, and suddenly Caleb and Lydia Ward became Caleb and Lydia Hale. "Congratulations," Morrison said as he stamped the final seal. "You're officially a family." But they had been a family long before the law recognized it, bound together by shared trials and mutual choice, rather than blood or legal documents. The papers simply made official what their hearts had already accepted. The journey back to Copper Ridge was a celebration of sorts, with Lydia healthy enough to sit up and take notice of her surroundings for the first time in months. She had grown during her recovery, developing from a frail infant into a robust baby with bright, curious eyes and an appetite that kept Caleb constantly busy. "Look at that," Marcus said with satisfaction as they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view. Home sweet home. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it, solid and welcoming against the backdrop of snow-covered peaks. But somehow it felt different now, not just a shelter from the world's cruelties, but a genuine home where people who cared about each other could build something lasting. Over the following months, as winter gradually gave way to spring, they settled into the rhythm of life on Copper Ridge. Caleb threw himself into his studies with the intensity of someone making up for lost time, devouring medical texts that Dr. Peterson lent him and practicing basic procedures under the old physician's patient guidance during monthly visits to Millfield. Lydia thrived in the mountain air, growing stronger and more alert with each passing week. She learned to sit up, then to crawl, then to pull herself upright on furniture, with the determined persistence of someone who had learned early that life required effort to master. "She's going to be a handful," Marcus observed one afternoon as they watched the baby systematically empty a low bookshelf, examining each volume with scientific curiosity before discarding it in favor of the next. "Good," Gideon replied with satisfaction. "The world's got enough timid people. What we need are more fighters." As spring turned to summer, word began to filter in from the outside world about the aftermath of their legal battle. Deputy Cord Alton had been tried and convicted on federal charges, sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for his abuse of office. The judge who had helped him, Morrison's brother, had been removed from the bench and was facing his own legal troubles. "Justice," Marcus said with grim satisfaction when they heard the news. Long overdue, but better late than never. But their victory had broader implications than simple revenge. The case had attracted attention from reformers in Denver and even Washington, leading to new legislation that strengthened protections for indentured servants and limited the circumstances under which children could be sold into bondage. "You started something," Dr. Peterson told Caleb during one of his visits. "People are talking about what happened here, and some of them are in positions to do something about it. The idea that their suffering might have served a larger purpose, that other children might be spared similar ordeals because of what they had endured, gave weight and meaning to memories that might otherwise have remained simply painful." As Caleb's 17th birthday approached, he received news that would change everything once again: acceptance to the Colorado Medical College in Denver, along with a scholarship that would cover most of his expenses. "How?" he asked Dr. Peterson, who had delivered the letter personally. "Turns out your story made quite an impression on some influential people," Peterson replied with a smile. "The dean of the medical school read about your case in the newspapers and decided that someone with your background and determination was exactly the kind of student they wanted to train." The prospect of leaving Copper Ridge, even temporarily, filled Caleb with complex emotions. This place had saved him, had given him and Lydia a family and a future when they had nothing left. The thought of abandoning it, even for the best possible reasons, felt like betrayal. 3 years, Gideon said when Caleb shared his concerns. That's all medical school takes, and then you'll come back here with the knowledge and skills to help people in ways that none of us can. But Lydia will be fine, Gideon interrupted gently. She's got Marcus and me to look after her, and by the time you graduate, she'll be old enough to decide for herself what she wants to do with her life. What if she doesn't remember me? What if she forgets? Caleb. Gideon's voice carried the patient authority of someone who had learned to see past immediate fears to longer-term realities. That little girl worships the ground you walk on. 3 years won't change that. And when you come back, you'll be able to give her opportunities that we never could have provided on our own. So in the fall of 1890, Caleb Ward Hale left Copper Ridge for Denver and medical school, carrying with him the hopes and dreams of everyone who had invested in his future. The parting was emotional but not final. This was not abandonment but investment in a shared future. Medical school proved to be everything Caleb had hoped and more. The coursework was demanding, requiring long hours of study and practice, but every lesson felt like a gift. He learned anatomy and physiology, pharmacology and surgery, obstetrics and pediatrics. He learned to diagnose diseases and treat injuries, to comfort the dying and celebrate new life. But perhaps most importantly, he learned that medicine was about more than technical knowledge. It was about serving others, about using skill and compassion to ease suffering and preserve life. It was about being worthy of the trust that people placed in you when they came seeking help. He returned to Copper Ridge each summer, marveling at how Lydia had grown and changed in his absence. By his second year, she was walking and talking, a bright, inquisitive child who seemed to find wonder in everything around her. By his third year, she was reading simple books and helping Marcus with the garden, already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that would define her adult character. Tell me about the hospital, she would demand during his visits, sitting in his lap by the fire while he described the cases he had seen and the procedures he had learned. She was particularly fascinated by stories about babies and children, asking detailed questions that suggested a natural aptitude for medical thinking. Maybe she'll follow in your footsteps, Gideon observed one evening as they watched Lydia carefully bandage a doll's injured arm with the seriousness of someone performing actual surgery. Maybe, Caleb agreed. But whatever she chooses to do, she'll have the freedom to choose it. That's what matters. Graduation day arrived in May of 1893, with Gideon, Marcus, and Lydia making the journey to Denver to watch Caleb receive his diploma. As he stood on the platform in his cap and gown, Dr. Caleb Hale looked out at the 3 people who had made this moment possible and felt a profound sense of completion. The boy who had stood on an auction block 6 years earlier, desperate and afraid, had become a man with the knowledge and skills to heal others. The baby who had nearly died from pneumonia and neglect had grown into a healthy, bright child with unlimited possibilities ahead of her. And the broken man who had paid $10 for 2 unwanted children had found purpose and meaning in ways he never could have imagined. "I'm proud of you," Gideon said simply as they gathered after the ceremony, and those 4 words meant more to Caleb than all the academic honors he had received. The return to Copper Ridge was triumphant, but also purposeful. Dr. Caleb Hale hung out his shingle and began practicing medicine in the territory where he had first learned the meaning of compassion. His reputation spread quickly here was a doctor who understood suffering because he had lived it, who could comfort families facing loss because he had faced it himself. Patients came from hundreds of miles away, drawn not just by his medical skills, but by his reputation for treating rich and poor with equal care and attention. He delivered babies and set broken bones, treated fever and eased pain, and slowly built the kind of practice that Dr. Peterson had always dreamed of creating. "You've done good work here," Peterson told him during one of his visits, now as a colleague rather than a mentor. "This territory needed someone like you." But Caleb's greatest satisfaction came not from his professional success, but from watching Lydia grow into the remarkable young woman she was becoming. By age 10, she was already showing signs of the compassion and intelligence that would define her adult character. She helped in the clinic when she could, reading to patients and assisting with simple procedures under Caleb's careful supervision. "She's got the touch," Marcus observed one day as they watched Lydia comfort a frightened child who had come in with a badly scraped knee. Natural healer, that one. Indeed, by the time she turned 15, Lydia had made her own decision about her future. She wanted to follow Caleb's path to become a doctor herself and serve the people of the territory who had so few medical resources available to them. "Are you sure?" Caleb asked when she announced her intention. "It's a hard life, especially for a woman. There will be people who don't want to be treated by a female physician." "Then they can suffer," Lydia replied with a combination of sweetness and steel that reminded Caleb powerfully of their mother. "I didn't survive pneumonia and nearly getting sold into slavery just to let other people's prejudices keep me from doing what I meant to do." The confidence in her voice, the absolute certainty of purpose, told Caleb everything he needed to know about the woman his sister was becoming. She would face challenges that he never had to confront, would have to prove herself in ways that male doctors took for granted. But she had something that couldn't be taught in medical school. She had survived the worst the world could throw at her and emerged stronger for it. When Lydia left for medical school in 1898, it was with the blessing and support of everyone who had helped raise her. The little girl who had once been property to be sold at auction was now a young woman with the education opportunity and determination to change the world around her. The years that followed brought changes to Copper Ridge that none of them could have anticipated. As word of the Hale family medical practice spread, other families began settling in the area, drawn by the promise of competent medical care in a region that had always lacked it. A small town grew up around the clinic with a general store, a school, and eventually even a church. Gideon lived to see his grandchildren, Caleb's children, and eventually Lydia's as well, playing in the same meadows where he had once thought he would live and die alone. Marcus remained spry and sharp well into his 80s, regaling younger generations with stories of the old days and the boy who had come to them from an auction block. And through it all, the cabin on Copper Ridge remained the heart of something larger than any of them had originally envisioned. It became not just a home, but a symbol proof that family wasn't about blood or law, but about choice, commitment, and the courage to care for others, even when the world gave you every reason not to. Dr. Caleb Hale lived to be an old man respected throughout the territory for his medical skill and his commitment to serving anyone who needed help regardless of their ability to pay. But he never forgot the auction block where his story began, never stopped being grateful for the $10 that had bought him and Lydia not just freedom from servitude, but entry into a family that would define the rest of their lives. Dr. Lydia Hale became the first female physician licensed in the Colorado Territory, eventually establishing a hospital in Denver that specialized in treating children and women who couldn't afford care elsewhere. She never married, dedicating her life instead to the practice of medicine and to proving that women could be every bit as competent as men in healing the sick and injured. And Gideon Hale, the broken man who had seen something of himself in 2 desperate children, lived long enough to see both of them become healers in their own right, carrying forward the lessons of compassion and resilience that had saved them all. On his deathbed at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return, Gideon spoke his final words to Caleb, who had rushed back from Denver to be at his side. "You were right," Caleb whispered, holding the hand that had once pulled him from an auction block toward an impossible future. "We weren't alone." "No," Gideon replied with the faint smile of a man who had lived to see his greatest hopes fulfilled. "We never were." The cabin on Copper Ridge still stands today, though it has been expanded and modernized over the decades. It serves as the centerpiece of a community medical center that provides care to rural families throughout the region, a living testament to the power of compassion to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. And in the lobby of that medical center there hangs a simple plaque that tells the story of its origins, how a $10 bid at a territorial auction became the foundation for a family, a practice, and a legacy that continues to serve others more than a century later. The boy on the auction block had become a man who changed the world, one patient, one family, one act of healing kindness at a time. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not just surviving what the world had tried to do to them, but using that survival to make the world a little bit better for everyone who came after.